Please be seated. Welcome. As Unitarian Universalists, it is our tradition to light the chalice at the beginning of a worship service, a memorial service, or even a small group meeting, as a visual reminder that we are entering into sacred time together. The ancient symbol of a chalice calls us back to our history, who we have been, and the flame within it reminds us of what persists throughout time: the warmth of the human spirit, the power of love, and the light of hope that can never be extinguished. This afternoon, we also light the chalice in honor of one special person, someone who brought light into our lives and whose spark lives on in our hearts. Today, we celebrate the life of George Bauer. You won't be able to see it because this big old pulpit is in the way, but I just placed a flower in what used to be, and in my heart will always be, George's seat. For my very first service during my candidating week here, a little over 4 years ago, I had the great pleasure of sitting right next to George. For a new minister, nothing could have been more reassuring than returning to my seat after giving a sermon and having George lean over and whisper, "Great." And best of all would be those times when I'd turn and find him wiping away tears, and he'd flash that impish smile and whisper, "Stop making me cry." I can't tell you what a gift that was. I will be forever grateful for his presence. So many of us gathered here today and scattered far and wide are grateful to have had the opportunity to be in the presence of George. Because George was someone who always said yes to life. And that yes was infectious. And even when he was ill, he was virtually unstoppable. Still playing tennis, still dancing. For George, traveling was a way of saying yes to life. Giving was a way of saying yes to life. And singing was most definitely a way of saying yes to life. Today, we celebrate the life of George Bauer. And as we do so, may our hearts resound with the joy and the possibility of yes. Thank you, Wendy and Diane. And we have a reflection from Lana Henson, fellow member of the choir and dear friend of George.
George was a tall, kind, elegant man, a consummate gentleman. He was very, very generous. Every Wednesday in choir, George would come bearing a box of chocolates. And we were always very happy to share his chocolate. During the pandemic, when we were no longer having church, the choir would gather upon occasion and go to a member's home for a birthday or whatever, and so we all drove down to Norman and got lost trying to find George's house, but we finally wound up on his front lawn and sang happy birthday to him. And George, being the typical generous person he was, had candy bars for all of us who came to sing to him. George was very successful in his life, and he gave a lot to this church. But one of the things that I knew about George, when he saw someone in need, someone in church, or someone that he knew from some other part of his life, he would quietly go about helping them, oftentimes anonymously, so they never knew, but he gave them help. But first and foremost in my mind, when I think of George, I think of the dancer. I met George for the first time in the late 80s at Contra Dance, which happens on Saturday nights in Daniel Hall here. And I was very fortunate because at the time, George did not have a lady friend. George was quite the ladies' man, and he always had a lady friend in his life, but at that time he didn't have one. And so I got to go dancing with George, and if you never had that pleasure, you really missed out. He was a superb dancer. He took me to fancy clubs that I had never been to and have never been to since, but it was wonderful because he knew all the ballroom dances, and it was great. Going back to George's generosity, he used to go on cruises. As Reverend Diana said, he loved to travel. And we would always eagerly await his return to choir to hear about his latest travels. And one spring, several years before he passed, he came in and he wasn't his usual upbeat self about his last cruise. Apparently the lady friend that he had taken with him did not meet up to his expectations, and he was very disappointed because he already had another cruise scheduled and paid for, but he didn't have anybody to go with him because he didn't want her to go. Well, being the kind person I am, I said, well, George, I'd be happy to go with you. And off we went. Actually, we went on 2 cruises together, and they were great fun because on cruise ships at night, they always have dancing. So I got to dance. But on the last cruise we went on, this Caribbean cruise, George became a superstar aboard the ship. I was out dancing with him the first night, and all the ladies were taken with this tall, elegant, older man who could cut a rug with the best of them. And so they started coming up and cutting in and dancing with him, and pretty soon he became very well known. And the rest of the time on the cruise ship, if I'd be with George at dinner or just walking on the ship and these women would walk past him, oh, you're George, aren't you? Oh, hi, George. I hope you'll save me a dance tonight. Needless to say, George loved it. He ate it up. I will miss George. He's been my friend for a very long time. I used to call him every week during the pandemic to check on him. And I would get on to him because he was still driving up here to go to the swing dance club, even during COVID. And I felt like that was really dangerous for him to do, but he was not going to give up his dancing. And I'm sure he is dancing still.
From the very beginning, there was music. George was born in Annapolis, Maryland, the youngest of 4 children. His father was director of the U.S. Naval Academy Band. And when George was just a toddler, his father was reassigned to lead the Navy Yard Band in Philadelphia. But tragically, his father died soon after that move. And George's mother took her children to New York City, to the borough of Queens. At Queens College, George sang in the Glee Club, and it was there that he first fell in love with dancing. In 1953, he was drafted into the Army, where he served at Camp Pickett in Virginia and later in Fort Riley, Kansas. When his service ended, he went into the field of publishing, a field not without its own dangers at the height of the McCarthy era. Working as an editor in Princeton, New Jersey, he married Marjorie Asbury, and they had 2 sons, Bruce and Stephen. It was at the time of his marriage that George became a Unitarian. Sadly, the marriage didn't last, but George's career in publishing took him to many places, and finally Oklahoma, where he worked as director of the University of Oklahoma Press until his retirement in 1997. There was no slowing down for George, though. He enjoyed international folk dancing, contra dancing, swing dance. He played tennis. He sang with the choir. He traveled. And he was a philanthropist, giving to countless individuals and at least 32 different organizations, including Planned Parenthood, Americans United for the Separation of Church and State, the ACLU, Veterans Families, First Unitarian, the Unitarian Universalist Association, and the UU Service Committee. Upon his death, we received a handwritten letter from the UUSC saying, "We are grateful for George's commitment to human rights, and we appreciate all he did to make the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee's work possible." Even toward the end, when he was in a good deal of pain, he wanted no sympathy, and he asked that we just keep treating him like nothing was going on. George was definitely a man of his time, kind, generous, and also stoic. When George first received the prognosis from his doctor that he could expect to live only 3 to 6 more months, the 2 of us had a long talk about his life and his wishes for the end of his life. And during that discussion, he mentioned the poem, "The Road Not Taken" by Robert Frost. And to be honest, I can't remember exactly what he said about it or how it came up, but in preparing for this service, I kept going back to that poem. And if you haven't heard it in a while, it goes like this. 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far I could to where it bent in the undergrowth, and then took the other, just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though as for that, the passing there had warned them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay in leaves, no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Now, I'll bet that many of you, like me, remember that poem not as the road not taken, but as the road less traveled. And that's because we want this poem, as we want our lives, to not be focused on regret. Somewhere ages and ages hence, we want to say that whatever else our lives might have been, at least they were original. At least we did what was unexpected, blazed our own trail. At least we can say, I did it my way. The thing is, when Frost wrote this poem, it wasn't intended to be in praise of personal originality or even integrity. It was written to poke fun at a friend of his, English writer Edward Thomas, who had a hard time making a decision and sticking with it. Frost and Thomas would often take long walks through the countryside, and Thomas was one of those guys who, regardless of which path they ended up taking, at the end of the walk, would regret that they hadn't taken the other one. He was like one of those people who see 5 lines at the grocery store, and he weaves back and forth between all of them until finally he has to choose one, and then he stands there bemoaning the fact that, of course, he chose the one where someone needed a price check. And maybe you are one of those people yourself. I know I am sometimes. The narrator of the poem has a dilemma. He has a choice to make. And he can't just stand there all day thinking about it. It's not that one path is wild and unmanaged while the other is paved and dull. The narrator clearly states that both paths have been worn really about the same. There's no clear choice, and the narrator appeases himself with the thought that it doesn't really matter, because he can always take the other path another day. He says this even though deep down he knows that life doesn't really work like that. Once you lock into one path, you're rarely, if ever, given the opportunity of going back and seeing what the other option might have been like. So really, the point of this poem isn't that the narrator had a choice and he chose the riskier, braver, more original option. It's that whatever the outcome, he is living with his choice. He doesn't regret it. He doesn't wonder, what if I'd taken the other path? Would that have been better? No. His choice mattered. It made all the difference. Not because it was outstanding and amazing, but because it was his. George Bauer lived a long, rich life. He made some great choices, and some that weren't so great. And there were important, formative events in his life, like the death of his father when he was just a toddler, or being drafted into the army, that he didn't choose at all. And I'm sure that there were times when he wondered how things might have been different if he'd taken another path. But what is true of the narrator in Frost's poem was true for George as well. In the end, what mattered most wasn't a particular path he chose. It was how he chose to move down that path. George went running. George went singing. George went dancing. And along the way, he shared whatever he had with the people he met on the path. Whether that came in the form of financial support or a kind word, a compliment, a hug, or an impish smile. This is one of the lessons that I take from George's life. Whatever path you take, the choice is yours. You can go down it with trepidation and regret, or you can dance your way to where it leads you.
You should always put the singer before the eulogy, because when you put the singer after the eulogy, the singer has been crying, and it's hard to sing. So excuse me, because this probably is not going to be real good. But let it be a dance we do. May I have this dance with you through the good times and the bad times too. Let it be a dance. Let a dancing song be heard. Play the music, say the words, and fill the sky with sailing birds. Let it be a dance, let it be a dance, let it be a dance. Learn to follow, learn to lead. Feel the rhythm, feel the need. To reap the harvest, plant the seed. Let it be a dance. Let it be a dance we do. May I have this dance with you through the good times and the bad times too. Let it be a dance. Everybody turn and spin. Let your body learn to bend. And like a willow with the wind, let it be a dance. Let it be a dance. Let it be a dance. A child is born, the old must die. A time for joy, a time to cry. Take it easy as it passes by. Let it be a dance. Let it be a dance we do. May I have this dance with you through the good times and the bad times too. Let it be a dance. Morning star comes out at night. Without the dark there is no light. If nothing's wrong, then nothing's right. Let it be a dance, let it be a dance, let it be a dance. Let the sunshine, let it rain. Share the laughter, bear the pain. And round we go again. Let it be a dance.
We have a reflection from Craig Bauer, who's a member of the Oklahoma City Swing Dance Club.
So I'll start by saying this. I feel like a lot of what I'm going to say is going to be repetitive. I'd break out a little list and run down it and realize that I'd pretty much be repeating things I've already heard. So I'm going to hold my chocolate and oranges for a little bit later and kind of not open with that. I came across a little nugget when I was, I should provide a little background. The first time that I talked to Bruce, we had a conversation about the fact that George and I shared surnames, so therefore we shared surnames. And the conversation wandered off into what the etymology of our surname is, and that got me into thinking, I went down the rabbit hole of thinking about George's name, his given name, and what the etymology of that was. That was a heck of a rabbit hole. I got out of that when I came across a little nugget that basically runs George's name back into the Middle Ages. And we were speaking of what was then St. George, and who literally had the equivalent of a cult following that developed throughout the Middle Ages. His name was kind of introduced into England, where he became the patron saint, and then was adopted by Venice, Genoa, Portugal, and Catalonia as their patron. Right? For all, it was recorded, that he was a personification of Christian chivalry. And I thought that pretty much defined our friend. By the way, the phrase by George, from By George He's Got It, was first recorded in the 1590s. So I'll shift back to our surname. When I first discovered that we shared a surname in the dance club, I don't know if, because I don't think we were always as close as people were in other organizations, we oftentimes take quite a while to learn somebody's last name. We're all oftentimes wearing little name badges just to help with our status in classes. So I didn't know George's last name until I took a position on the board of the club. From that point forward, for quite a while, when people query whether or not I'd seen George, I would tell them that my younger brother hadn't been here, hadn't shown up yet. That went on for quite a while till George caught it, and that's when he finally figured out what my last name was. So our club's involvement with George, he'd been there forever. I've been there a few years comparatively. I can't really look at his long history. I just know the time that I've known him. But we also have our chocolate and oranges association with him. He did essentially the same thing. He would give gifts of chocolate initially to dancers. That later was expanded to oranges because he'd found dancers that would prefer not to have or couldn't have the chocolate. That's apparently when we started getting oranges and chocolate. I knew I wanted to make a small homage to George when I came here to bring oranges and chocolates. But I wanted to get exactly the same chocolates that George would bring. And since George never gave me any chocolates, I had to go ask the women what the chocolates were. I went to a table of very experienced dancers, mentioned what I want to do, and they asked him what the name brand was, and nobody replied. And I said, where did he get them? And in unison, they said, Aldi's. And then they started telling me which ones they preferred. So my wife and I went to Aldi's, and we bought them all. The oranges sometimes had a little extra touch added to them in that we had a dance floor with seating on each side. And if George danced with someone from the other side and didn't have the orange with him to offer as a gift when he escorted her back to her seat, he'd return to his seat and then roll the orange across the dance floor. Flashing that impish grin. Yeah. We all know George loved to dance. But my wife and friends tell me that that was secondary, excuse me, to the conversation that took place on the dance floor. That it was more about that than just the dance. Although I expect some of our newer dancers found that pretty disconcerting because I understand it started from the very beginning. Well, they were still trying to count steps. George was asking questions non-stop. Like the other organizations here, George was extraordinarily generous to our club during part of the pandemic recovery. Excuse me, I don't know where the frog's coming from. George was very, very generous during that period of time, and is personally responsible for keeping our doors open during a couple of really bad months. I feel fortunate to have count him as a friend, and I and the rest of us will miss him.
We have a moment. If there's anyone else who would like to say a few words, we'll just invite you to come up to the lectern.
I joined this church about 5 years ago. And at first I didn't know George because I didn't get wrangled into choir by Beverly until the spring the next year when I said, oh, I play the flute, can I play with you sometime? And immediately George was the very first person to give me a hug. He was also the very first person to say, I'd like to take you out to lunch. And I actually had to ask someone, who is this guy? It's kind of creepy. Why is he taking me out to lunch? And everybody said, oh, he's very sweet, he's safe, he's not some crazy person. So we had a nice lunch. And I think George was actually a little disappointed that he could not help pay off my medical school loans because I had already paid it off. He's such a generous guy. He helped a lot of, I think especially women, pay off their student loans. But I knew George through the choir, and something that is near and dear to my heart and is super important is that George paid for the bathroom that is just right back here. It's actually called the Bauer room, but I didn't know that or the Bauer room, because we all call it George's bathroom. But that room has been so useful. I've cried in there, I've changed clothes in there, put on makeup, I've helped other people do things in there, but it's just a nice little cubbyhole, and there's a little tiny plaque, because I was thinking, oh, we should put a big plaque. I had to actually get up and squint and say, it was put there in 2002, so it's been there a long time, but I think probably every single choir member that's ever been in this church since then has used the toilet, and we all think of George when we use the toilet.
My name is Margaret. I moved to Oklahoma 10 years ago because my sister's husband died prematurely at the age of 52. And so I was coming up from Dallas every weekend, to go to the kids' sing-songs and games and all that stuff. And my sister would invite me to her church group and this and that, but I was like, I need my own life. So I started going to the ballroom dance, and then I met George. And he was so good to me because he knew all the dance moves, and I'm as coordinated as a snail. So he was very patient, and we'd dance around, and he was very whatever. And then every week he'd take me out to dinner, because I was alone, and we'd go to he liked to go to what is that horrible self-serve place, Corral? Golden Corral? Oh my God. And I'm like, George, I can't eat enough to make it worthwhile for you. I can't eat enough. And so, then we would just go, I'd bring a Whataburger to him. And he doesn't like onions. Oh my God, Whataburger is because of the onions, And so I'd get a Whataburger for him without the onions, and I'd have the onions because I like the onions and the mustard. But, he helped me out financially. I had an emotionally abusive husband. I was divorced, and I moved to Oklahoma to take care of my sister, who was so sad because her husband died at 52. So I started going to the swing dance club and learning those dances, and George was so patient with me, and I really appreciated that. At one time he talked about marriage, and I'm like, George, I'm not getting married again. I was bad, I'm not getting married again. And he was like, and then one time he said, why won't you marry me? And I said, George, when I was growing up, we had 2 pairs of shoes, the church shoes and the tennis shoes we wore to school. And unless our toe was out an inch, we couldn't get new tennis shoes. So I have 50 pairs of shoes. And I said, George, if I wanted to buy 51, you would have a heart attack and die keel over. And he said, yes, I would. So anyway, we were not compatible, but we were great friends. And, I went over to see him all the time, and for 8 years or 9 years. And then when COVID happened, I'd call him once a month and catch up, and then he got cancer, and I was so sad. And then he lived on and on and on and on and on. And so, Bruce, I was calling him, and I was saying, George, what the hell? You're not calling me back. I don't think I put that on. I don't think I said that. But the point is, why aren't you calling me back? And then Bruce contacted me and said he's passed away on June 18th, which is my dad's birthday. And so, he was the greatest guy. He gave so much money to, me, I was overwhelmed, but to people in college who were struggling. And one time I found a man who needed some scholarships, and he said, no, my mom struggled so badly raising me. I give money to women. And I understand that. And I missed him from early in May. He didn't respond, and Bruce, he didn't respond. I'm so happy to be here and to recollect his life. We laughed. He is so funny. We danced. He can lead me when no one on earth can. And I really appreciate his existence.
I just wanted to say that George was a generous person. When you would dance with him, he would tell you stories of women he was hoping to help and things he would love to do. I think he was a little put out with me once because we went to dinner. We met for dinner before one of the dances, and I knew he was going to try to pay, and I surprised him by grabbing the check. And I don't think he liked that very much. He kept trying to reschedule so he could pay me back for dinner. But anyway, he made you feel like you were the most beautiful woman in the whole world when he was dancing with you, but not in a creepy way. He was very much a gentleman. He had the warmest eyes and a warm personality. And the chocolates that he gave, I still have one framed. My favorite was mint. And I have it framed. It's in my office where it will remain, and I will always think of George. I also have the last chocolate he ever gave me in my refrigerator, so I will remember him very fondly. He was a wonderful, wonderful man.
Sorry. You all have heard that George was a great father, a devoted churchgoer, dancer. But to me, he was an inspiration. And I say this because I didn't even know George very long at all. We became more friends a couple of years before his diagnosis. And we talked all about OU. We were always following OU women's basketball, but especially the softball team. And we just, got to know each other more. And then when he did get his cancer, he told me about it on the dance floor while we're in the middle of, a West Coast swing move. And it just took me back, the strength and just what he had going on to continue to live no matter what. And we talked about things, and it was like, my goodness, George, you are such an inspiration for what you do, what you stand for. So we got closer and closer. We watched a lot of softball games together. And especially the last year, every game, we were either on the phone, and I'd be listening on the radio, he'd be listening or watching, and we'd call each other when his favorite player, Josh Linallo, got another home run. And he'd call me in the middle of whatever, and he'd say, she just got 115, she just got 117. I mean, he just loved her, and he loved that softball team. And even the last time he was in the hospital, it was during regionals. And he said, we got to watch the game. And so we found it on ESPN, and we're sitting there in the hospital, and the game goes off. And he's going, what happened to the game? And ESPN had switched it over, and he was going, you got to find the game. I'm going, I don't know where the game is. So we start going through the channels, and there it was. And we finished watching it in the whole World Series. We were in contact for every game. I had my grandkids on the Monday that OU played you at UCLA the first time. And we were at Riversport, and I'm calling George saying, what was the score? How did we do? And he is going crazy because OU had lost. And he's just telling me the play-by-play. And even on the very last game, which was just a couple of weeks before he died, he's sitting there high-fiving, we're watching the game. I mean, the whole thing, it was like there was nothing going on in his life that was that kind of a negative. So again, he was a great father, tennis player, scholar, but to me, he was a great inspiration. And I just hope that I can use that as a guide, that someday I could be an inspiration like he was.
My husband Henry and I, since 1977, we're so lucky to have George as a wonderful neighbor. As everyone else is expressing, his heart was so open, and so loving. And a few years ago, my husband and I suffered an unfortunate, sad event where our oldest daughter had a schizophrenic and bipolar breakdown on national TV. She made the CNN, the 4 o'clock, Channel 4, Channel 5, even NBC news programs with her breakdown of vandalizing numerous places in Oklahoma City and Norman. And we were, of course, as most parents would be, we were horrified. We knew that something had been wrong with Allison for probably 7 or 8 years. And she turned herself in to the Norman police, and she served 8 months in detention. I just wanted to tell you that, you know, it was George that was the first person to come to our front door, knocking on it, and embracing and hugging us, and telling us how much he loved Allison. And at that time, we did too. We were just in a state of shock and horror. But he came down and embraced us with his understanding and compassion for the mentally ill. And he left us feeling so hopeful. And he said, you're going to get through this. God is, you are in, it's like the old song, he's got the whole world in his hands. And that's what George was reminding us of, is that she was in God's hands. And she's home now, she's safe, and she takes her medicine, and she's very, very happy to be at home. But the first person to come and tell us that she was going to be okay was George Bauer. And that is what I wanted to tell everyone, that I know that from experience, his open, loving heart, and my husband and I cherished his friendship. And we will miss seeing him walking out, taking his little bit of whatever he could find of trash or debris in his yard. He would take it out there faithfully and have it for the trash men. And he would be in his little red and black flannel pajamas and always dressed to the nines. I mean, he always had on something very nice. Thank you.
Thank you. Would you please join me in a spirit of prayer or meditation? Spirit of life, source of love, today we lift up in celebration our remembrances, our gratitude for being on this planet at the same time as our beloved George. We are so grateful for the grace, the chivalry, the fascinating conversation, the joy, the music, the dancing, for the light that he brought into our lives. But as we lift up our gratitude today, we also hold in our hearts all those who are deeply sad and who will be missing George today and for many days. We think especially of his son, Bruce, and daughter-in-law, Alicia, and grandson, Brendan. We think of all those who had a special place in their hearts for George. And I want to lift up those organizations, the dance club, and the First Unitarian Choir, that have lost several members in recent years, and who are trying to make sense of so much sadness. May our hearts be lightened by joyful memories. May our lives be enlightened by the good model that was his. May it be so. Amen. If you would, as you are able, in body or in spirit, please rise to sing hymn number 6. It's in the gray hymnal, Just as Long as I Have Breath. After our service today, all are invited to fellowship in Daniel Hall. To get to Daniel Hall, you just go through this set of double doors, down the hall, and right to your right. But for now, I leave you with this blessing. Whatever your song, may you sing it with passion. However you dance, may you dance with joy. Wherever you travel, may you remember that you don't travel that path alone. May you care for your companions and give of yourself as you are able, even as you remain open to receiving care and kindness. May you say yes to truth, to life, to love. May it be so. And as the postlude plays, I invite everyone to stay as the family exits.